Once Hitler gained absolute control as dictator of Germany, he immediately brought about a revolution in post-World War I diplomacy and worked to upset the balance of power established after the war. The Nazi invasions of the European continent would once again plunge the continent and soon the world into war once again. Hitler had risen to power in Germany in large part by claiming the Versailles settlement after World War I was unjust and unfair and deliberately humiliating for Germany. To that end, Hitler endeavored to reassert Germany's role on the continent and whittle away at the Allies' impositions on Germany. He was often able to get away with each step along the way because the Allies of Western Europe so feared a return to war once again. In 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor, he pulled Germany out of the Geneva Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations, which signaled he endeavored to recover the German economy by an arms buildup to generate full employment. In 1935, Hitler announced a new military draft and the creation of a new air force, or Luftwaffe, in Germany. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, which it had been deprived of after the war. In 1936, Hitler contracted an alliance with Mussolini, forming the Axis powers of Germany and Italy. Likewise, in the same year, Hitler created an alliance with Japan against communism, particularly Soviet communism, in the Anti-Comintern Pact. In a bold move to expand German territorial holdings, in 1938 Hitler concluded the Anschluss, or annexation of his homeland Austria, incorporating it into a Greater Germany. In 1938, Hitler would demand still more territory at the Munich Conference, eventually occupying the entirety of Czechoslovakia. And in 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union would contract the Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, in which both nations promised not to invade each other. Thus, in just a few short years, Hitler had pulled off a stunning reversal and defiance of the terms of the Versailles Treaty, dramatically expanding Germany and setting the table for the next war. The Anschluss, or annexation, of Austria was particularly a significant accomplishment for Hitler. Austria was, of course, the land of his birth, and he claimed millions of ethnic Germans living in Austria desired to be part of the new Third Reich. A substantial section of the German army marched into Austria in early March 1938 and was greeted by thousands cheering their arrival, tossing flowers, cheering and celebrating their unification with Germany. Austria had, of course, lost most of its empire after World War I, so to be part of the expanding Third Reich was met with great celebration. The Anschluss was ostensibly conducted by plebiscite, or a national vote, to supposedly determine what the Austrians themselves wanted. A ballot for the Anschluss is shown here, and as you can see, those that wanted to support the Anschluss had a large circle to check, and those that opposed had a small circle. Thus, even the ballot itself encouraged compliance. The Anschluss thus was a foregone conclusion. It would not have been an accurate referendum in any case, and on March 15, 1938, Hitler himself came to Vienna to announce the incorporation of Austria into the new Third Reich. Austrian Jews were immediately harassed and persecuted once the Anschluss took place. Jews in Vienna were immediately forced into the streets to hand scrub the streets as Austrian residents and German soldiers harassed, insulted, spat upon, and beat them. Many Jewish businesses and synagogues were attacked with windows smashed and fires set. Once Hitler secured control of Austria, he next set his sights on the mountainous region of western Czechoslovakia. Hitler was particularly interested in this area and incorporating it into the Third Reich due to the abundance of ethnic Germans or German-speaking Czechs in this region. Hitler therefore started to demand the annexation of the Sudetenland and used increasingly belligerent language to justify its acquisition. By late 1938, Britain and France finally began to realize that Hitler had little interest in stopping his territorial demands and that he was willing to use the threat of war to get what he wanted. Britain and France believed it was time to sit down with the German dictator to stop the march towards war and further German violations. It was at the German city of Munich that the two sides met in conference in September of 1938. Hitler acted as the gracious and polite host for the event, alongside his ally Benito Mussolini. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier met the two dictators at Munich, representing the Allied nations. Hitler laid out the reasons why the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia should belong to the Third Reich, and railed against all the abuses Germany had suffered under the Versailles Treaty. The German leader assured the Allies that he simply wanted the Sudetenland to be part of Germany, and that this was the last of his territorial demands. He promised he would not seek further land acquisitions. Desperately eager to avoid another costly and destructive war, particularly when their own nations had not really yet recovered from the First World War, the British and French leaders consented to Hitler's requests and gave over the Sudetenland to Hitler with the stroke of a pen. The Czechs themselves were not even invited to the conference. Neither were they consulted. Hitler had completely tricked the Allied leaders and had no intention of abiding by the Munich Agreement when it was no longer desirable. The very next month, in October of 1938, the German army rolled into the Sudetenland, again to many cheering crowds, because they too would become part of the Third Reich. Those who dissented or opposed the surrender of Czech land at Munich were silenced and suppressed. In violation of the Munich Agreement, in the following year, Germany would proceed to occupy the entirety of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, however, believed that he had scored a great diplomatic victory. He believed that Germany's advances would be stopped, that Hitler would abide by the signed agreement, and that a state of peace would endure in Europe. He was met by large, exultant crowds at the airport when he returned to London. They too were eager to avoid another war. Upon his return, Chamberlain proclaimed, "The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you." Later that day, he stood outside number 10 Downing Street and again read from the document and concluded, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time." Those words, "peace for our time," could not be more incorrect or tragically short-sighted. For in less than a year, the greatest of world wars would break out, and Chamberlain, having lost all credibility, would be removed from his position as British Prime Minister. Additionally, ominously, the following year in 1939, Hitler dispatched the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim von Ribbentrop, to Moscow to negotiate with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin a non-aggression or peace treaty. The publicly released portions of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact assured each nation that the other would not invade. Thus Germany would be assured of a peaceful Eastern Front, so that it could turn its attention towards the West. The secret portion of the treaty divided up the nation of Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union. The portion of the treaty would not come to light until later the same year. Stalin, who did not trust anyone, made the fatal decision of trusting Hitler, and that peace would prevail between both nations for the extended future. In accordance with the secret portion of the treaty, Nazi Germany invaded neighboring Poland on September 1st, 1939. Thousands of troops, vehicles, tanks, and aircraft rushed across the border deep into Poland in an invasion that moved with unprecedented speed. Only some leaders in the West, such as Winston Churchill, saw the invasion coming. For many in the West, Germany's invasion of Poland was positive proof that Hitler had no intentions of abiding by his words and that another continental war was inevitable. Polish forces were quickly overwhelmed by the Wehrmacht, or German army. The Poles did not have the same technological advancements or numbers that the Germans had, and despite fighting bravely for their homeland, they stood little chance of blocking the invasion. Major Polish cities were attacked from the air and ground and quickly occupied. Taking advantage of Poland's vulnerabilities, the Soviet Union implemented the secret portions of the Non-Aggression Pact 2 weeks later and invaded Poland from the east, grabbing large swaths of land for itself. The Nazi invasion of Poland, and then subsequently Europe, employed a new form of warfare hitherto unseen in the history of the world. It was known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The approach emphasized speed and quickly adapting on the battlefield to overwhelm an enemy. Armored vehicles such as trucks and half-tracks could quickly position troops. Speedy tanks overwhelmed defenses with their firepower and sheer numbers. Enemy units were surrounded and defeated, often before they knew what was happening. Much more devastating than during the First World War, the Luftwaffe would rain down destruction from the air. Enemy armies were struck with strafing and bombs with little ability to respond to the bombardment from the air. The Stuka dive bomber, a lightning-fast fighter bomber developed by the Germans, proved its devastating effectiveness immediately in the invasion of Poland and struck fear in the hearts of enemy populations as the shrieking descent of the Stukas ended only with bombs released on the vulnerable below. Poland was effectively subdued by the Germans from the west and the Soviets from the east in about 2 weeks. For the remainder of the war, it would be an occupied nation. Approximately 6 million Poles would perish during the Second World War. Many of them were Jews who were particularly targeted for extinction. A ghetto was immediately demarcated for the Jews in Warsaw, where they were corralled and forced to live for the remainder of the war. Food shortages and sickness were in abundance in the ghetto, and thousands would be deported from the ghetto only to be sent to the gas chambers of various concentration camps. Poland itself would be the location where a multitude of camps were constructed. The 3 million Polish Jews that would die in the Holocaust would represent half of the total number of Jews that did perish in the Holocaust. Realizing that they had been lied to by Hitler by the Munich Agreement, the Allies of Britain and France responded to the Nazi invasion of Germany by declaring war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Thus, the war that so much of Western Europe feared finally came to be in the autumn of 1939. Germany secured its occupation of Poland and took its time turning towards the west. Ironically, the British and French troops that prepared for a German invasion of the West became bored and impatient in waiting because they anticipated a swift German attack. When the attack did not come immediately, they dubbed the Western Front a phony war or fake war. Some even began to speculate that the war would not actually go any further than Germany's invasion of Poland. Perhaps Western Europe would be spared from further conflict. Those aspirations, of course, proved to be tragically flawed once Hitler commenced his invasion of the West the following spring. With its non-aggression pact in place with Germany, the Soviet Union took advantage of the West's preoccupation with Hitler to move into the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Stalin also chose this moment to acquire more territory in the far north by invading Finland, known as the Winter War for the frigid conditions and the amount of fighting in the snow. Soviet forces met entrenched and determined Finnish forces once they crossed into Finnish territory. Prospects for swift victory were turned back, even as the Soviet army suffered large losses and inflicted abundant damage in Finland. The Finns fought boldly and courageously to defend their homeland, often meeting and eluding Soviet troops on skis. The Finns, who were more acclimated to moving in the inclement conditions, held off large-scale Soviet advances. A peace treaty signed in 1940 brought an effective end to the Finnish-Soviet War, with Finland only making minor territorial concessions to the Soviets. The phony war came to an end in April of 1940 when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Sweden remained neutral during World War II and carried on a lucrative iron ore trade with Nazi Germany. To secure that supply of iron ore, Germany invaded Sweden's neighbors. German paratroopers dropped into Denmark, including the capital of Copenhagen, and subdued the nation in a few hours. Almost laughable was the contingent of Danish soldiers rushing to the front on bicycles, where they would encounter German tank units. Being completely outmatched, Denmark would remain occupied throughout the war. Norway, too, suffered under Nazi occupation for the duration of the war. What made the defeat of the Norwegians worse was the assistance Norwegian collaborators provided for the Nazis, particularly the Norwegian fascist Vidkun Quisling. Quisling established himself as the pro-Nazi Norwegian prime minister during the war and oversaw the implementation of the Holocaust in Norway and the imprisonment of thousands of his fellow citizens. The Norwegian monarchy and legitimate government fled into exile to London. Quisling became such a notorious traitor that thereafter the word Quisling itself has become a reference to traitors or collaborators. Quisling would eventually be removed from power and charged with treason and executed in Norway after the war. Nazi Germany unquestionably ended the so-called Phony War in May of 1940 by finally turning its attention west and invading Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The superior German forces quickly overwhelmed these states, and historic monarchies and governments were also forced into exile to await the end of the war. Cities in the Low Countries that demonstrated resistance faced the horrible effect of blitzkrieg and the leveling of their territories. Once the Nazis established control of these conquered states, they immediately implemented harsh repressions and also began deporting the local Jewish populations to concentration camps to the east. With the subjugation of the Low Countries, it was clear that France was the next target of the Nazis. It was along this next front that the First World War had become bogged down, with neither army able to dislodge their opponent for most of the duration of the war. Many wondered if the new war would experience the same reality. Anticipating another German invasion at some point in the future, the French had constructed a long series of defensive fortifications along its border with Germany, known as the Maginot Line. Named after the French Minister of War during the 1930s, André Maginot, the Maginot Line was a long series of bunkers, tank traps, machine gun, and heavy gun emplacements along the French-German border. The French government had spent a great deal constructing the defenses, believing them to be impregnable. Defenses were more spotty and thinner along the French border with Belgium and Luxembourg, but most French military planners believed the Ardennes forest would be too dense and difficult for a German invading army to traverse. French overconfidence in the protection afforded by the Maginot Line, however, proved to be grossly misplaced. The Germans were savvy enough not to charge head-on into the Maginot Line's defenses, and instead went over and around the defensive line. German paratroopers dropped in behind the line in French defenses and immobilized guns and took key positions. Many of the French guns only aimed towards the east, and therefore could not be turned to the rear where the enemy was. Many German armor units poured quickly through Belgium, overwhelming the resisting French and British. Still others proved mobile enough to navigate the heavily forested and dense rolling hills of the Ardennes and invade France. With little to stop them, the Nazi steamroller moved quickly past the French defenses and continued its breathtaking blitzkrieg into the interior of France. The key dramatic moment for Allied forces occurred in late May and early June on the Western Front. The Allies were utterly unable to hold back or even slow down the Nazi advance into Western Europe. So quickly had moved German forces that British and French troops found themselves surrounded at the French seaport of Dunkirk, with the Nazis before them and the English Channel behind them. Approximately 400,000 troops were completely surrounded and faced imminent destruction on the beaches of Dunkirk. Suddenly, and almost inexplicably, the German tank divisions halted their advance for 3 days. These 3 days were critical, as they gave the British time to execute Operation Dynamo, which was the evacuation of British and French troops from the coast of France across the English Channel on board all types of military and civilian boats. The Royal Navy sent out a call for every seaworthy ship to cross the Channel to ferry soldiers from the French coastline back across the Channel to England. Every type of vessel, yacht, fishing boat, whaling ship, paddle boat, fireboat, and tugboat was pressed into service to help rescue the Allied soldiers. In one of the most strategic withdrawals ever, approximately 338,226 of the 400,000 British and French troops were evacuated from the coast and carried safely to England. The delay of the Germans in pressing the attack on the surrounded soldiers was a strategic blunder that kept England in the war, and thousands of the troops evacuated at Dunkirk would return to the continent 4 years later to invade Nazi-held territory and liberate it for the Allies. With the successful evacuation of British and French troops at Dunkirk, very little stood in the way to block Hitler's further advance into France. In fact, the German army now had what they never had in the First World War, virtually an open road directly to Paris. Remaining French troops put up token resistance against the blitzing Wehrmacht, and entire units surrendered or collapsed before the onslaught. Thousands of French soldiers were taken prisoner. To the great humiliation of its proud residents, the capital of France, the City of Light, Paris, fell to the Germans on June 14, 1940. Entire German columns rode through the city streets, much to the consternation of its citizens, who now faced a lonely and oppressive occupation for the next 4 years. To the great humiliation of the French, the German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe, the symbol of Napoleon's and France's military glory. Their parade continued down the Champs-Élysées before the eyes of the Parisians. Nazi swastikas went up all over the city, and the German occupying authorities were seemingly everywhere. The resident Parisians and the occupying Germans settled into a tense accommodation with each other for the duration of the war. German soldiers and officers were frequent patrons of Paris's sidewalk cafes and restaurants and rode on the subway. Residents usually endeavored to ignore them and not engage them. Often Parisians would not look their occupiers in the eye and would walk with their heads pitched down. For this reason, during the war, Paris became known as the city without a face, as people concealed their faces and did not want to be singled out, stopped, questioned, or detained by the Germans. There were many Parisians who believed the occupation would be permanent and therefore engaged or even collaborated with the occupying Germans. Some Germans had French girlfriends, mistresses, or even wives. Those that assisted and collaborated with the Germans would face intense public scorn after the war or even death. But during the occupation, many French believed accommodating the Germans was the practical course to follow. Hitler was so delighted and proud of his forces for taking Paris that he took a trip himself to occupied Paris in June of 1940. He briefly toured the city's major landmarks and structures and was photographed in front of the Eiffel Tower. Although not a German city, Hitler had immense respect for the cultural history of Paris and was interested in preserving it, and considered it a great treasure in the 1,000-year Reich he presumed to be building. For much of the war, the Nazis occupied only the northern and western portions of France, which included Paris. Hitler was interested in retaining the strategic areas and the coastline, and probably recognized France was too large and would require too many troops to occupy effectively. Therefore, a rump state was created out of France in the south known as Vichy France. This drastically reduced French state held its capital at Vichy in the center of France and remained free territory for much of the war. Vichy France, as established and permitted to exist by the Nazis, was also required to be supportive of the Nazis and not working to undermine the Nazi-occupied lands in the north. Vichy France was led during the war by the Vichy president Philippe Pétain. Pétain's leadership of Vichy France and his willingness to collaborate with the Germans made him a very controversial figure in French politics for the rest of his life. Pétain was a national hero after the First World War due to his leadership after the Battle of Verdun, which led the French troops to victory. But for many French, they could never forgive Pétain for accepting Nazi rule and the authority of Hitler over the homeland. French Jews often suffered the same discrimination and oppression their kinsmen faced in other occupied countries. Parisian Jews were forced to wear the Yellow Star of David, singling them out, and thousands of Jews would be deported to concentration camps, often with the assistance of their fellow French countrymen. With the collapse of the French state, its division into two territories, and the complicity that Vichy France demonstrated with the Nazis, a small group that opposed Nazi rule developed immediately upon the occupation. The assumed leader of the so-called Free French was the French general Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle had served notably during the First World War, and while in exile in London, claimed to be the voice and authority of all his French countrymen who opposed Nazi rule. De Gaulle, whose massive ego and characteristic abrasiveness would often alienate the Allies, nevertheless, he was a powerful voice during the war, rallying his countrymen to resist Nazi oppression. The longer the Nazi occupation of France continued, a growing resistance movement formed in France that was determined to drive out the Nazi occupiers. Lacking formal organization or leadership, small bands of assassins and saboteurs formed up in Paris and throughout the countryside. Members of the French resistance endeavored to harass and impair the Nazi occupation at every turn. Railroad tracks were blown up that the Nazis used to move troops and military vehicles. German officers were machine-gunned as they sat in a sidewalk cafe. Telephone lines were cut. Allied soldiers were assisted in their escape. The resistance was determined to make the Germans as uncomfortable as possible during the occupation and do whatever they could to assist the Allied war effort. Members of the resistance came from a broad cross-section of French society, with Catholics and Protestants and Jews too participating. Young and old, and male and female, each found a role and a means to contribute to the effort. One of the more famous female members of the French resistance was Simone Seguin, whose nom de guerre was Nicole Minet. Although only a farm girl, Seguin joined up with the resistance and was involved in multiple sabotage and assassination missions for the resistance, gaining international fame when she appeared in Life magazine. French society would be divided throughout the war regarding the Nazi occupation. Some were indifferent, some collaborated with the Germans, and others resisted to the point of giving their lives for the freedom of France.